Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof like distant artillery fire, each drop a reminder of the shells that had fallen silent 3 weeks ago, when the front collapsed and left these 23 women kneeling in the mud with nowhere left to run. The bamboo shelter offered no real protection. Water streamed through gaps in the palm thatch, pooling in the red clay between their knees. The smell was thick and wrong diesel fuel mixing with boiled rice and human sweat, the scent of defeat hanging heavy in the tropical humidity that made every breath feel like drowning in warm soup. Under that leaking roof, 23 pairs of eyes stared at mud. Just mud, brown and churned and streaked with yesterday's rain. Mud that told no stories. Mud that kept its secrets. Mud that couldn't betray you if you looked at it long enough to forget you were human. But mud has no memory. Only eyes do. And on that March morning in 1945, one woman decided hers would speak. The whistle shrieked across the compound. Sharp, mechanical. The kind of sound that strips away everything soft and leaves only obedience or punishment. An American military police officer, boots caked in the same mud, the women knelt and barked the order that had become their morning prayer, their evening benediction, their constant reminder of where they stood in the new order of things. Keep your head down, 3 words in English. Then the translation delivered by a weary corporal whose Japanese carried the flat accent of California's Central Valley. A Nisei second generation caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. Heads down, hands on knees. The words crashed over them like waves over drowning swimmers. Some of these women still wore fragments of their old uniforms, white cotton, stained gray with mud, and time Red Cross armbands faded to pink ghosts of their original purpose. Others clutched torn blankets around their shoulders, rice sackcloth repurposed into dignity. They had surrendered weeks ago near Luzon's northern coast, pulled from makeshift field hospitals after the Imperial Army's front lines shattered like rice paper in a typhoon. Some had been nurses, some teachers, some just young women who'd answered their country's call and learned too late that patriotism and survival rarely share the same address. There were rumors about this camp, whispered between women in the dark hours when guards changed shifts and the spotlights swept across the wire. They said the Americans who ran this place followed something called the Geneva Rules, that there was paperwork involved. Procedures. That cruelty here came with forms in triplicate, but procedures have many faces, and politeness in English can still break bones in Japanese. The officer's words filtered through the interpreter's mechanical translation sounded almost apologetic, almost kind, right up until they weren't. One order, then another, then the silence that comes when there's nothing left to say except the unspoken threat hanging in the humid air like cordite smoke. Rain dripped through the roof, soaking into the women's hair. Black hair, brown hair, some streaked with premature gray from nights spent running from American planes that turned the ski into a furnace. No one dared raise her head. The command had been clear as rifle fire. Eyes down, hands on knees. Become small enough that maybe they'll forget you're here. Yet beneath the mud and obedience, beneath the exhaustion and the hunger that made their hands shake when they tried to hold a rice bowl steady, something flickered, small as a candle flame in a storm, fragile as spider silk, dangerous as gasoline near a match. Defiance. The young prisoner in the second row felt it rising like floodwater behind a weakening dam. Her name was Keiko Yamada, 28 years old. Before the war, she had stood in front of 30 children in a sun-filled classroom in Kyoto and taught them the difference between obedience and dignity. She would write on the blackboard in careful characters that her students would copy into their notebooks like scripture. Dignity cannot be commanded, only chosen. The chalk dust would drift in afternoon light while she explained that true respect flows from within, not from the barrel of a gun or the threat of punishment. That a person who kneels because they choose to stands taller than someone who stands because they're forced. 4 years later, she knelt in Philippine mud with rain running down her neck, and her husband's death notice still unread in a bundle at the bottom of her pack. 4 years later, those words tasted like ash and broken promises. Her instincts, trained by years of watching children test boundaries and learning which lines could bend and which would break, whispered a truth that made her spine straighten a fraction of an inch. When someone forces you to look away, that's when they fear your gaze the most. 15 feet to her left, a guard shifted his stance. The rifle strap squealed under the strain of damp leather against wet metal. His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth, maybe 20 years old, maybe less. Freckles splashed across his nose like paint flecks. Red hair darkened by rain to the color of old blood. He wasn't shouting now, just watching with the kind of stare that makes a person smaller, that chips away at the edges until you forget you ever had a shape that belonged to you alone. The rain grew heavier, turning the world into watercolor streaks. For a brief second, Keiko Yamada wondered if anything existed beyond the barbed wire. If somewhere her 6-year-old son Takeshi still remembered her face. If her mother-in-law was telling him stories about his father dead now for 14 months at Saipan. If the letters she'd written, 17 of them, carefully composed in the quiet moments between air raids and artillery, had made it past the censors and across the ocean to tell her boy that his mother was still alive, still human, still here. Her mind replayed her own mother's voice speaking from a distance of years and miles that felt like light years. Keep your head high, walk like you own the ground beneath your feet. Let them see you're not ashamed to exist. The irony cut deeper than any interrogator's question. Here she knelt, head bowed, hands on knees, existence reduced to not causing problems for the men with guns. Then without meaning to, without planning it, without considering the consequences that could range from a beating to a bullet, Keiko Yamada's chin rose. Just 1 inch, maybe less. Barely perceptible in the driving rain, but enough. Her eyes caught a sliver of light reflecting off the young guard's belt buckle. Polished brass gleaming even in the gray morning. Standard U.S. Army issue. The kind of small detail that becomes enormous when you're not supposed to see it. A tiny rebellion against the command that defined their days. A microscopic revolution in the space between obedience and dignity. The guard froze. Billy Walsh, though Keiko didn't know his name, would never forget this moment. 19-year-old farm boy from outside Portland, Oregon, who'd lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor because all his friends were going and staying home, felt like cowardice. 3 years later, standing in Philippine rain with a rifle he prayed he'd never have to fire at someone who wasn't firing back, he locked eyes with a Japanese woman who wasn't supposed to look at him. And the world forgot how to reign. Time stretched thin as wire. Every prisoner in that bamboo shelter froze mid-breath. Even the rain seemed to pause, droplets hanging in the air, like the moment before a photograph snaps and traps everyone in amber forever. That forbidden glance felt louder than gunshots. His face hard from months of watching friends die, and harder still from orders that made his stomach turn, betrayed something no one expected from an American military policeman in March of 1945. Uncertainty, not rage, not cruelty, not even contempt. Just the confused look of a boy who'd been told these women were monsters and was discovering they had eyes that looked too much like his mother's. Then came the sound that shattered the stillness. Crack. A bamboo rod slammed into the mud 3 inches from Keiko's knee. The water that had pooled there exploded upward in a spray of brown droplets that hit her cheek like a cold slap. Sharp enough to sting, cold enough to remind her that moments have consequences and consequences have teeth. The guard beside Billy Walsh, Corporal Jenkins, 40 years old and tired to his bones, had struck downward with the kind of precision that comes from wanting to hurt without quite crossing the line into visible cruelty. Missing Keiko by intent or accident, no one could tell. The bamboo rod quivered in the mud between them like an exclamation point at the end of a sentence written in violence. Someone shouted. The words blurred into noise. Boots shuffled through puddles, creating small tsunamis that washed against the kneeling women's legs. Rifles clanked against belt buckles and buttons as men adjusted their grips, readied their stances, prepared for whatever comes next, when prisoners stopped being predictable. But no one moved for a long few seconds. The air thickened electric with potential energy. The kind of charged atmosphere that comes before lightning strikes or bullets fly or someone does something that can't be undone. Later that night, when darkness finally gave them permission to speak in whispers, the story spread through the camp like sparks from a campfire catching dry grass. The one who looked up. That was how the rumor began, simple and dangerous, and impossible to verify, but too compelling to ignore. Women repeated it softly while ration lines formed, each woman receiving her fistful of rice and cup of thin broth. While bandages were changed in the medical tent, where supplies ran short and infection ran long. While letters were written in careful script and then burned before the guards could read them and find reasons to punish collective guilt for individual thoughts. That look became legend, forbidden and therefore precious, dangerous and therefore worth remembering. A single moment of defiance that proved they were still capable of choice, even if the only choice left was where to point their eyes. But there was context these women didn't have. Information that lived in American military reports typed in clean offices far from mud and rain and the smell of defeat. Context that would have made Keiko's small rebellion make terrible sense. Discipline problems had surged during the last months of the Pacific Campaign, spiking 3 times higher than in the early days after Pearl Harbor, when everything was clear and enemy meant evil and good men didn't question orders. Fatigue heat, tropical diseases that turned strong bodies into hollow shells, and something harder to name in military paperwork, guilt. It tore through the units faster than malaria, harder to treat than dengue fever, more debilitating than any wound that left visible scars. Soldiers like Billy Walsh, trained to see the Japanese as subhuman fanatics who'd rather die than surrender, found themselves guarding women who looked tired and scared and far too human. Orders said, treat them firmly. Experience said they're not shooting back anymore. Conscience, that inconvenient voice that training tried to silence, whispered questions no one wanted to answer. From where the women knelt, the confusion looked different. We saw anger in their faces, one survivor would recall decades later, when historians finally thought to ask. But also fear. Not fear of us, fear of themselves. Fear of what they might become if they followed every order without question. That fear made sense only later when survivors pieced together fragments of understanding from the rubble of memory. When they realized that the young guards weren't monsters, just boys who'd seen too much death and were terrified of becoming the kind of men who could inflict it without flinching. Keiko Yamada lay awake that night on the bamboo slat floor of the women's barracks, listening to rain drum against canvas roof. 23 women packed into a space meant for storage, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, because body heat was the only warmth available and loneliness could kill as surely as a bullet. She tried to imagine her son. Takeshi would be 6 now if the math was right, if time still worked the same way in a world turned inside out by war. She tried to picture his face, but the image kept slipping like soap in wet hands. Would he be taller? Would his voice have changed from that high, sweet pitch that made her heart ache? Would he remember her at all, or would she return home to a stranger who called someone else mother? Instead of Takeshi's face, she kept seeing the young guard's eyes. Billy Walsh's eyes, though she didn't know his name, and wouldn't learn it for another 47 years when a historian tracked her down in Kyoto and showed her photographs from Army archives. Those eyes had flickered like a candle on the edge of dying. Fear and confusion and something that might have been recognition. The startled look of someone who'd been taught a story about monsters and just discovered the story was more complicated than the storytellers admitted. Somewhere outside the barracks, hidden in the gap between guard shifts, when the spotlight swept past and created pockets of shadow, someone whispered her name, Yamada-san. The formal honorific, a small gesture of respect, in a place designed to strip away everything that made them individuals instead of inventory. The legend was spreading faster than she could stop it. By morning, everyone would know about the woman who looked up and lived. Some would exaggerate the story, adding details that made it more dramatic, more heroic, more useful as resistance, even if the resistance was only in their minds. By next week, the story would have grown wings. By the time the war ended, it would be mythology. But tonight, it was just Keiko Yamada lying in the dark listening to 22 other women breathe and wondering if looking up was the bravest thing she'd ever done or the stupidest. Wondering if bravery and stupidity were different things at all. By dawn, the camp hummed with whispers like a hive coming awake. The storm hadn't stopped. All night, sheets of rain had turned the yard into a mirror of brown water that reflected nothing but clouds and barbed wire. But beneath the dripping roofs and sodden canvas, a story took shape like pottery on a wheel. She looked up. Someone murmured it while washing her face in the communal basin water so cold it hurt to touch. She didn't bow. Another woman whispered it while accepting her morning rice, the grains already turning mushy in the humidity. The story moved from tent to tent like contraband, passed from woman to woman in glances and nods, in the careful language of people who've learned that words can be weapons turned against you. Even women who hadn't been in the bamboo shelter yesterday, who'd been in the infirmary with dysentery or malaria or the exhaustion that came from bodies pushed past their limits, swore they'd seen it happen. The phrase, "keep your head down," now carried weight it hadn't before. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In a place designed to make them invisible, one woman had chosen to be seen, and somehow impossibly, she'd survived the choosing. Keiko didn't speak about it. She pressed her wet blanket tighter around her shoulders, rough wool scratching against skin that had forgotten what softness felt like, and pretended not to hear the whispers that followed her like shadows. But the others glanced at her. Quick looks, fearful and reverent in equal measure. The way people look at lightning strikes or miracles or disasters that could have been them but weren't. A woman in the next row, Fumiko Saito, 24 years old with hands that never stopped trembling from months of field surgery without anesthesia, passed Keiko a scrap of rice paper, small enough to hide in a closed fist. On it, written with a stolen pencil stub, worn down to barely more than graphite and wood, were two words in careful script. You remember? Keiko hesitated. The question had layers. Remember what that dignity is chosen, that we're human, that somewhere beyond this wire and mud, there's a world where mothers raise sons and teachers fill blackboards with lessons about honor. She tucked the paper inside her sleeve, feeling it scratch against her wrist. That was how the secret diaries began. Not as grand gestures of resistance, not as historical documents meant for museums and scholars, just as tiny acts of remembering in a place designed to make them forget they'd ever been anything but numbers on a roster. Small pieces of paper hidden in the seams of torn uniforms, wrapped in waterproof leaves stolen from the jungle. Beyond the wire, passed from hand to hand when guards weren't watching. Women writing in the dark by moonlight, or the dim glow of distant fires recording what the official histories would ignore. 19 women alive in Block 3. Rice reduced to half ration. No letters this week. One guard cried. The smallest details became lifelines. Evidence that they existed. Proof that they were here, that they mattered, that their lives counted for something more than casualty statistics in captured enemy personnel. But rumor has its own power separate from truth. The guards began to notice the way the prisoners looked at each other. Not with the blank exhaustion that had characterized the first weeks after surrender, but with something else. Something that looked like purpose, like coordination, like the dangerous possibility that defeat didn't mean submission. They couldn't prove anything. No one had found the papers yet. No one had intercepted the whispers, but suspicion crept into every patrol, every roll call, every interaction between captors and captive. The Americans were getting restless in their own right. The war was winding down. Everyone could feel it. Germany had collapsed. Tokyo was burning. The emperor would surrender any day now, maybe any hour, and then what? What happened to the guards who'd followed orders? What happened to the prisoners who'd survived them? Food was spoiling faster than it could be eaten in the tropical heat. Mail routes were failing as shipping priorities shifted to actual combat zones instead of prisoner administration. Discipline reports, though heavily redacted when they reached headquarters in Manila, showed a pattern of breakdown. Not rebellion exactly, but something harder to name. A loosening of the structures that kept everyone in their assigned roles. That evening, the storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived in earnest. Wind tore through the camp like invisible hands ripping at anything not nailed down. Canvas flaps lifted and snapped with sounds like rifle shots. Lanterns extinguished, plunging the compound into darknesses broken only by lightning that turned everything white and sharp-edged for half-second intervals. Someone shouted, a guard's voice swallowed by thunder that felt close enough to touch. In the chaos, one of the sleeping tents collapsed. Women screamed not from injury, but from the sudden burial under wet canvas and broken bamboo poles. Guards ran with flashlights that created more confusion than clarity beams swinging wild through the rain. The guards were counting heads. Voices calling out numbers in English, then Japanese, then English again, as if repetition would make the math work out differently. One name didn't answer. Keiko felt the chill race down her spine despite the tropical heat. She was standing now. They all were pulled from sleep by the storm and the shouting. Water ran in rivers through the compound, turning pathways into streams, washing away the careful boundaries between prisoner space and guard space. Someone was missing. In a camp where every person was accounted for 3 times a day, where roll call was sacrosanct, and numbers were everything, someone had become uncountable. The rain hammered harder, erasing footprints before they could be followed. washing away any evidence of direction or intention. Lightning split the sky, and in that flash of illumination, Keiko saw the fear on the guards' faces. Not fear of the missing woman, fear of what her absence meant, fear of the paperwork, fear of the questions, fear of being blamed for losing inventory that was supposed to stay found. As the thunder rolled and the wind screamed, and the guards fanned out into the storm with their rifles and their flashlights and their shouted orders, that the weather turned to nonsense, Keiko Yamada realized something that made her stomach clench. The rumors had become something more dangerous than talk. Someone had acted on them. Someone had decided that if one woman could look up and live, maybe someone else could walk away and survive. She didn't know who was missing yet, didn't know if it was planned or panic or simply someone caught in the wrong place when the tent collapsed. But she knew with the certainty of a teacher who'd spent years reading young faces and understanding unspoken intentions that everything had just changed. The forbidden glance had been the spark. But this was the fire beginning to catch. And fires once started in places built from bamboo and canvas, and human desperation don't stop burning just because someone orders them to. The storm didn't end. It only got meaner the way tropical weather does when it decides to remind humans how small they are. By midnight, the camp had become a swamp lit by searchlights that turned every raindrop into glass shards suspended in the air. Floodlights sliced through sheets of rain, creating columns of illumination that revealed nothing useful. Just water falling, mud rising, and the silhouettes of men with guns trying to find one woman in a jungle that swallowed sounds and secrets with equal appetite. Boots splashed through puddles that used to be pathways. A whistle screamed across the yard, the sound barely audible over thunder that felt like it was splitting the earth open. The command came harsh and mechanical through the storm. Count again. Someone shouted it in English, then Japanese, then English again, as if the language mattered when the math kept coming up wrong. One of the Japanese women was gone. Not dead, not sick in the infirmary, just gone like smoke, like hope, like all the promises anyone had made about this being a temporary situation that would end with everyone going home. Keiko stood with the others in the rain, drenched to the bone, trembling not from cold, but from the understanding that collective punishment was coming. She'd seen it before. One person breaks a rule and 23 women pay the price. That's how it worked. That's how it had always worked. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, but her mind raced. Who was missing? She tried to count the shapes around her in the darkness, tried to match silhouettes to names, but the rain made everything blur into shadow and suggestion. The guards were young and angry and afraid. Fear is easier to aim than a gun, easier to justify than violence. Fear transforms prisoners into threats, and missing people into conspiracies, and one confused woman lost in a storm into evidence of mass rebellion. A Jeep engine coughed to life near the gate, sputtering twice before catching. Sergeant Daniel Cooper climbed in, his jaw clenched so tight Keiko could see the muscle jumping even from 30 feet away in the rain. His voice carried that careful calm that meant anything but. Search the perimeter, standard sweep pattern. No one fires unless fired upon. The Jeep roared into the darkness, wheels spitting mud and rooster tails that caught the floodlights and turned brown into bronze. Behind it, soldiers fanned out in pairs, flashlights, bobbing like fireflies that had forgotten how to glow properly. In the rain, standing with 21 other women, because someone had become 22 and now was one again, Keiko whispered to no one in particular and everyone who could hear, "She'll die out there." No one answered. They all knew. The jungle beyond the wire didn't forgive mistakes. It had teeth made of thorns and slopes made slick with moss and streams that looked ankle deep until you stepped in and discovered they went to your chest. It had snakes that killed in minutes and insects that killed in days and 1,000 ways to die that didn't require Japanese soldiers or American bullets. Between the lightning flashes and the shouting and the mechanical sounds of a camp mobilizing for a search, Keiko could hear other things. The snapping of branches in the wind, the echo of boots in water, the faint hum of insects that never cared about war or sartsuis or which flag flew over their section of jungle. Somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the light, beyond the reach of orders and punishments, and the careful structures that kept everyone in their designated places. The missing woman was alone. Her name, Keiko would learn 2 hours later, was Fumiko Saito, the young nurse with trembling hands who'd passed her the rice paper note that morning. 24 years old. Field nurse trained in Tokyo, served with the Imperial Navy Medical Corps since 1942. She'd survived 3 years of war, air raids, hunger, malaria that came back in waves even after treatment. And now this. Reports filed after the war would confirm numbers that no one talked about during it. Between February and June of 1945, at least 12 escape attempts were recorded in camps across Luzon. Most ended the same way. Either the jungle swallowed them or the guards did. Either way, they stopped being countable and started being cautionary tales. Inside the compound, silence turned suffocating. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of breath held too long. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone's waiting for something terrible to resolve itself into something specific they can react to. The women knew what the Americans feared. They feared our escape more than our hatred, one survivor would say years later in an interview conducted in careful English. It was true. The Americans had been told that every Japanese captive was trained to deep rather than surrender. That capture meant shame worse than death. That prisoners would take any opportunity to flee, even if fleeing meant dying in the attempt. To lose one meant failure, shame, paperwork that asked uncomfortable questions, an admission that the systems designed to keep people contained weren't working anymore. Hours crawled past like wounded animals. The storm finally thinned from downpour to drizzle, from sheets of water to scattered drops that fell lazy and fat from leaves overhead. The floodlights dimmed as generators strained and fuel ran low. The searchers returned in ones and twos, empty-handed and mud-covered and tired in ways that had nothing to do with the physical effort of walking through jungle in the dark. Just before dawn, when the sky turned from black to gray without ever bothering with color in between, the guards came back. Sergeant Cooper led them, uniforms soaked through, face unreadable, in that way soldiers have when they've learned that showing emotion is the same as showing weakness. In his hand, something small, wrapped in mud-streaked cloth. Not a weapon, not evidence of escape plans or conspiracy, just an object ordinary and devastating in equal measure. A photograph. Behind him, limping but alive, soaked and shaking and covered in scratches from thorns that had fought her every step, came Fumiko Saito. Keiko's breath caught, relief mixed with dread, because survival didn't mean safety and being found didn't mean forgiveness. It just meant the punishment could be administered to a living person instead of becoming another statistic in a report that no one would read carefully anyway. Cooper held the photograph carefully, like it might dissolve if he gripped too hard. In the growing light, Keiko could see it was a picture of a child. Small boy, maybe 4 years old, standing outside a wooden house. His smile was faint eyes squinting into sunlight that belonged to a different world. A world where children stood outside houses and smiled at cameras, and the future stretched ahead like a road with no visible end. Fumiko tried to explain through broken English and trembling gestures, her voice barely audible over the residual rain. Words tumbling out in fragments. My son. Letter. Home. Send. Please. The photograph was of a little boy who might have been alive or dead in Tokyo or Osaka or any of a dozen cities that American bombers had turned into charcoal and ash. A little boy who might remember his mother or might have learned to call someone else by that name. A little boy who existed somewhere in the gap between hope and certainty, and Fumiko had risked everything just to try sending him this proof that she was still his mother. Cooper said nothing. His silence stretched longer than it should have, heavy with implications and decisions not yet made. Another guard, younger and harder in the way men get when they're scared of their own compassion, snapped out the obvious. No personal mail. Rules are rules. The word hung heavy. Rules were what separated order from chaos. What let 19-year-old boys from Oregon guard 24-year-old women from Tokyo without having to think too hard about the parallels. Rules were the bureaucratic armor that protected everyone from having to acknowledge that the people on the other side of the wire were people at all. Cooper tucked the photograph into an envelope. Manila folder, standard issue, the kind used for forms and reports and documents that would be filed and forgotten. He sealed it without ceremony and walked away without a word, his boots squelching in mud that tried to hold him back with every step. Keiko watched Fumiko sink to her knees in the mud, not because she was ordered to, but because her legs simply gave out. The nurse's hands pressed together in front of her chest, not in prayer exactly, but in something that looked like prayer's exhausted cousin. The gesture of someone who had spent everything and had nothing left but muscle memory of supplication. Around them, the whispers started again. Contraband. Forbidden. Dangerous. That photograph meant more than any ration, more than medicine, more than the letters from the Red Cross that occasionally made it through sensors with half the words blacked out. It was proof of a world before the cages. Evidence that they'd had lives that mattered to people who weren't counting them like inventory. Later in the mess tent that smelled of rust and boiled vegetables and despair disguised as nutrition, the guards argued among themselves. Voices carried through the thin canvas walls. Some said the photograph should be destroyed. Too much emotional disruption. Can't have prisoners getting attached to things. Makes them harder to manage, harder to move harder, to process through the system that was already breaking down under the weight of too many people and too few resources. Others shrugged with the practiced indifference of men who'd seen worse and knew that paper was just paper. It's just a picture, one muttered. Let her keep it. What's the harm? But paper was power here. Even the American censors destroyed 1 out of every 5 letters before they ever left the camps. The decisions made by board clerks who'd never met the writers and didn't care about the readers. Control didn't need bullets when silence worked just as well. Maybe better. Bullets left evidence. Silence just left questions that no one could prove used to be answers. That night the wind returned, but the rain had mercy and stayed away. The camp lanterns swayed on their posts, shadows bending across the barracks, in patterns that looked almost like the bars of a different kind of cage. One made of light instead of wire, but just as effective at keeping people contained. Keiko couldn't sleep. The bamboo slats under her back were harder than they'd been yesterday, or maybe she was just more aware of them. More aware of everything. The way Fumiko breathed too fast in the darkness. The way someone 3 bodies over kept making small sounds in her sleep, words in Japanese, too quiet to understand but clear enough to recognize as nightmares. She kept thinking about that little boy's face. Somewhere, if Tokyo still stood, if the firebombing had spared his neighborhood, if luck and fate, and all the things people pray to when they've run out of logical options, had aligned, that boy might be staring at the same sky. Different hemisphere, different circumstances, but the same sky that covered everything and divided nothing. When morning broke with the metallic taste of humidity and diesel fumes, the guards lined the women up again for roll call. Standard procedure, 3 times a day, every day, without exception. The math had to work, the numbers had to match, everything had to account. But Sergeant Cooper was missing from formation. So was the envelope. So was the photograph that a young nurse had nearly died trying to preserve. Fumiko's hands shook violently as she searched. The ground, her sleeping mat, the folds of her clothing. Everywhere and nowhere. Nothing. The photograph was gone. And this time even the Americans looked uneasy. Not because of what was lost, but because of what the losing meant. Something had shifted in the night. Some invisible line had been crossed, or maybe just acknowledged. The careful distance between guards and guarded, between duty and humanity, between following orders and questioning them, had grown thin enough to see through. Everyone could feel it. The atmosphere had changed the way air changes before an earthquake, before a tsunami, before any disaster that announces itself not with sound, but with the sudden absence of sound. Birds stop singing. Insects go quiet. The world holds its breath and waits. By noon, the camp had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with heat or exhaustion. This was a different kind of stillness. The kind that comes when everyone's doing calculations in their heads about how much longer the fragile peace can hold. The guards weren't shouting anymore. They were whispering, which was somehow worse. Whispers meant uncertainty, meant the command structure was fracturing, meant that even the people with the guns weren't sure what they were supposed to do next. The missing photograph had become a problem nobody wanted to own. It represented everything uncomfortable about the situation. A prisoner who'd risked her life not to escape, but to preserve a memory. An American sergeant who'd confiscated it, but then made it disappear in a way that couldn't be explained by regulation or procedure. A system that was supposed to be simple us versus them, good guys and bad guys falling apart under the weight of too many gray areas. Cooper had vanished into the command tent where the typewriter clacked and stopped like a mechanical heartbeat deciding whether to quit. The sound carried across the compound. each keystroke a small violence against silence, each pause a moment where someone was choosing what truth would be recorded and what truth would be conveniently forgotten. Outside, the prisoners waited under a sun that had decided to stop being merciful. Heat shimmered off puddles that refused to dry. The humidity made breathing feel like drowning in air. Heads bowed not from orders now, but from the simple physics of necks that couldn't hold up skulls when the body had been running on rice and exhaustion for too long. The bamboo interrogation tent stood apart from the barracks like a shrine to questions no one wanted to answer. Two floodlights hung from poles, their glass covers clouded with dead flies. Even the insects here died trying to reach something bright. Inside that tent, Sergeant Daniel Cooper faced his commanding officer. Lieutenant Morrison was a man whose face looked carved from regulation itself. 42 years old, career military. Boston police before the war, which meant he knew how to see threats in shadows and guilt in silence. He'd lost a brother at Iwo Jima 3 months ago, and the grief had calcified into something harder than anger, harder and more dangerous. Morrison sat behind a folding table that served as his desk, his throne, his judgment. Seat. A single folder lay between them. Inside it, presumably the photograph, the evidence, the problem that needed solving. It's a breach of procedure. Morrison's voice carried the flat affect of someone reading charges. You let sentiment cloud the chain of custody. Cooper didn't answer immediately. The photograph lay between them like an accusation. Water-wrinkled paper. The boy's face still smiling through time and mud, and the distance between what people are supposed to do and what they actually do when no one's writing it down. Morrison wanted it logged as unauthorized material, filed, classified, made into another piece of paperwork that would justify whatever came next. Cooper wanted it returned, wanted to believe that small acts of mercy didn't require permission slips in triplicate. Neither would happen. Morrison's pen hovered over a form, waiting to make the whole thing disappear in ink. Not the photograph itself, but its meaning, its implications, the uncomfortable questions it raised about who these prisoners were and what we owed them, and whether procedures were protecting anyone or just protecting the people who made them. Meanwhile, outside in the yard, Keiko and the others were ordered to stand in formation. Collective punishment disguised as inspection. The sun baked through their wet clothes, turning fabric into steam that rose off their shoulders like guilt made visible. A guard paced back and forth, counting them over and over, 1 through 23, then again, as if the repetition itself could restore order, could make the world make sense again, could answer the question that no one was asking out loud, but everyone was thinking. If one photograph can cause this much trouble, what happens when they start remembering they're human? Somewhere behind the canvas curtain that separated the command tent from the rest of the camp, voices rose and fell. Cooper's voice, usually measured and calm, cracked on a word that sounded like conscience. Morrison's response was too quiet to hear, but the tone carried. Cold, dismissive. The sound of a man who'd made his decision and wasn't interested in being persuaded otherwise. The Americans were trapped in their own contradiction. Officially, the Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded humane treatment of prisoners. The document said it right there in language carefully crafted by diplomats who'd never had to enforce their own rules. Respect, dignity, recognition that surrender didn't erase humanity. Unofficially, Pacific Command called those guidelines suggestions, recommendations that applied when convenient and were quietly ignored when they weren't. As evening fell and the shadows grew long enough to provide some relief from the heat, Cooper finally stepped out of the command tent. His eyes looked hollow, not tired exactly, emptied. The look of someone who'd spent hours arguing for something he believed in and lost to someone who didn't care about belief, only about order. He passed the assembled women without speaking. The photograph was gone again. Filed, hidden, erased from official record, if not from memory. His hands trembled as he adjusted his helmet strap, a small tell that most people would miss. But Keiko, trained by years of watching children lie about who threw the first punch, caught immediately. Shame. She saw it flash across his face. Brief as lightning, but just as illuminating. The look of a man who'd been told to do something he knew was wrong, and did it anyway because disobedience had consequences, and consequences had teeth. That night, in the dim light of his quarters, a space barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker, and the weight of decisions that wouldn't fit in either. Daniel Cooper opened a diary that wasn't his. He hadn't meant to take it, didn't plan the theft. But during the afternoon's barracks inspection, standard procedure to search for contraband or evidence of conspiracy or anything that could be used to justify tightening the rules that were already strangling everyone, he'd found it under an old woman's sleeping mat. Rice paper stitched together with thread pulled from a torn sleeve. The cover made from pages that had once been something else, something official repurposed into chronicle. Careful handwriting and Japanese characters he couldn't read, but understood anyway because some things transcend language. Day 42. Food thin. One of us sings softly at night so we don't forget voices. He didn't speak Japanese, but there was enough English mixed in enough words that crossed between languages because suffering has a universal vocabulary that he could piece together meaning from fragments. A soldier looked away when I cried. I think that was kindness. Cooper stared at those words until they blurred. He hadn't written anything in months. Not letters home because home was a house in Cleveland that had been sold to settle his mother's estate after she died while he was deployed. Not reports beyond what was required because putting truth on paper meant someone might read it and ask why he let truth exist in the first place. Somewhere in Ohio, among legal documents from his mother's estate, her business affairs had been settled by lawyers. But the letter that mattered, her last personal letter, written in November, when the cancer was winning, and she knew it but didn't want to say it directly, because mothers protect their children, even from the truth of their own dying, he'd carried in his jacket pocket for 6 months, unopened. Because opening it would make her death real in a way that telegrams and funeral notices somehow didn't. Outside his quarters, guards played cards under a tarp stretched between posts. Their laughter sounded forced, desperate. The kind of laughing people do when they're trying to convince themselves that everything's fine, even as the world unravels in slow motion around them. According to records that would be compiled and analyzed decades later, more than 16% of military police officers in the Pacific had been teachers, clerks, bureaucrats, men of paperwork and rules, men who joined because they believed in structure and order and the idea that civilization was worth fighting for. Men who were discovering that civilization looked different through barbed wire than it did in recruiting posters. Cooper had been a teacher too. History, American government, civics class for 11th graders who thought the Constitution was boring until he made them understand it was the only thing standing between them and tyranny. Maybe that was why the diary hurt so much. It reminded him of students who trusted him to tell the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. The candle on his foot locker guttered, throwing shadows across the bamboo walls like the bars of a cage that existed only in light. He kept reading, turning pages with the care of someone handling explosives. They say we are enemies, but when they look at us, I see something like pity. Or maybe they see themselves. That sentence hit harder than any artillery barrage he'd survived. Harder than Guadalcanal. Harder than the 3 days on Bougainville when his unit got separated and he'd thought he would die in jungle that didn't care which side he'd been fighting for. From outside, the sound of boots approached, night patrol shifting. Cooper closed the diary, fast heart hammering. He shouldn't have it. Possessing prisoner materials was a violation of protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. This kind of understanding. This kind of recognition that the people you're guarding have interior lives that complicate the simple narrative you've been told about who deserves what. But he couldn't put it back either. That book was the only honest voice left in a camp built on silence. The only record that might survive to prove they existed as something more than numbers on a processing form. He slipped it beneath his jacket, the paper scratchy against his undershirt, blew out the candle, stepped into the night where rain had returned soft this time. Not punishment, not violence, just water falling because that's what water does. Washing over everything like forgiveness. It came too late to fix anything but might at least rinse away some of the mud. At dawn, the loudspeaker crackled with a new order from command. One that would break the thin peace all over again. One that would force everyone to choose sides in a conflict that wasn't supposed to have sides anymore, because the war was ending and winners and losers should have been obvious. But nothing was obvious anymore. And the orders that came through that speaker would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the wire. It's the one who makes you choose between duty and decency and then punishes you for choosing wrong. The morning broke with a mechanical voice cutting through mist that rose from the ground like ghosts reluctant to leave. All prisoners assemble. Yard. Immediate compliance. The words came through speakers mounted on poles, turned metallic and inhuman by amplification that stripped away anything resembling mercy or doubt. Sergeant Daniel Cooper stood near the gate, jaw tight enough to crack Moeller's raincoat unbuttoned, despite the drizzle that had started before dawn and showed no signs of stopping. In his pocket, folded into quarters and pressed against his ribs, like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed, the diary he'd taken from Haruko's sleeping mat burned with the weight of words that wouldn't stay silent. The paper in his other pocket carried new orders from headquarters. Commands filtered down through layers of bureaucracy until they arrived here in this mud-soaked camp at the edge of nowhere, translated into action items and operational directives in language designed to make cruelty sound like logistics, demonstrate discipline, break morale, ensure obedience for inspection. In military language, typed on forms in triplicate and signed by officers who would never have to watch their orders executed, it sounded sterile. Professional. In reality, it meant one thing: humiliation, the kind that leaves no visible scars but carves trenches through the soul. The bamboo yard filled with rows of women kneeling in mud that had been churned by boots and rain until it resembled clay more than earth. Their uniforms hung in tatters, some still marked with the faded red crosses of medical corps, others just fabric that had given up, pretending to be anything but rags held together by stubbornness and thread. Rainwater ran down their faces like tears that required no emotion to produce just gravity and weather, and the laws of physics that didn't care about dignity or shame. Cooper avoided looking at them directly. Didn't need to. Could feel their presence like heat from a fire or cold from ice. 23 women reduced to the mathematics of crowd control. Behind him, Lieutenant Morrison read the directive aloud. Every word slow and clear, projected across the yard with the satisfaction of a man who believed discipline was the same as righteousness. Heads down, remain until ordered. No talking, no moving, no existing except as instructed. Cameras clicked somewhere in the background. Documentation for the records. Proof that procedures were followed. Evidence that could be filed away and pointed to later when questions arose about treatment of prisoners. See, we kept notes. We had witnesses. We followed protocols. The command wanted to test control, to make these women bow not just their heads, but their humanity, to remind them that surrender meant more than laying down weapons. It meant laying down everything: hope, dignity, the memory of ever having been anything except defeated. Cooper clenched his fists inside his pockets. Orders like this weren't new. Reports compiled after the war would list 37 psychological control drills conducted across Pacific camps during March of 1940, each one designed to remind captives who held power, who decided when they ate, when they slept, when they were human, and when they were merely inventory to be stored and counted. But something about this morning felt different. Maybe it was the silence. No one cried, no one begged, no one performed the expected theater of submission that made punishment feel justified. Just the sound of rain on canvas and the heavy breathing of people trying to become invisible by holding perfectly still. Cooper walked past the rose boots, squelching in mud that grabbed at his heels, like hands trying to hold him back from something he shouldn't do. He passed Keiko Yamada in the second row, fifth position from the left. Her head was bowed as ordered, but her hands didn't tremble, didn't shake, didn't give any indication that this was breaking her the way it was supposed to. For a second, he thought she might speak, might break the silence with words that would force him to respond, to choose between enforcing the order and acknowledging she was a person making a choice to address him. But she didn't. Just knelt there with rain soaking through her torn uniform and mud on her knees and that scar on her hand, the one shaped like a crescent moon visible where her fingers pressed against her thigh. From somewhere near the back, a voice rose, barely a whisper, barely audible over the rain, but clear enough to carry meaning across the silence that had turned oppressive. Fumiko Saito, the young nurse who'd nearly died searching for a photograph that had been taken from her again, spoke in Japanese. They wanted to teach us shame. The guard beside her barked for silence. Standard response. Textbook enforcement. But Fumiko didn't stop. Her voice stayed soft but gained something that sounded like steel wrapped in silk. Cooper looked toward the ridge where the officers stood, clipboards in hand, observing like scientists watching an experiment. The demonstration had worked on paper. Orders given, orders followed. Prisoners contained and controlled and reminded of their place in the hierarchy that war had created. But inside the camp, beneath the surface of compliance, something unseen was shifting, growing, building pressure the way steam builds in a closed vessel with no release valve. Eventually physics wins. Eventually something breaks. Rain started falling harder, blurring the faces of guards and prisoners into one gray sea of shapes that looked less like people and more like shadows cast by something larger than any individual. And then amid the sound of water hammering earth and orders being shouted and clipboards being checked and cameras recording evidence for files that would gather dust in archives for 70 years, another voice cut through. Quiet, firm, impossible to ignore. One word in English, clear as a bell, final as a door closing. No. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet, but would be. Cooper felt time slow down the way it does in the second before a car crash, or a bullet impact, or any moment when the world pivots from what it was to what it will be, and there's no going back. Keiko Yamada's head was no longer bowed. She looked straight ahead. Not at any guard in particular. Not at Morrison on his platform, or Cooper standing frozen 3 feet away. Just ahead, into space, into the future, into the possibility that dignity isn't given or taken but simply exists independent of permission. Rain streaming down her face made it hard to tell where water ended and tears began if there were tears at all. Her eyes sharp as broken glass, not angry, not defiant in the way that invites punishment. Just present, just there, just refusing to pretend she didn't exist. For a moment, no one moved. The guards hesitated, rifles heavy in hands that weren't quite sure what they were supposed to do with this kind of resistance. The kind that doesn't fight back, but doesn't retreat either. The kind that makes you question whether what you're doing is following orders or just following the person in front of you off a cliff. Then another woman lifted her head, Haruko, the old one, with gray streaks in her hair and a blind eye that had gone milky white from infection. Then another, Michiko. Then her sister Sachiko. Within seconds, spreading like cracks through ice, nearly every prisoner was looking up. A field of eyes in the rain, silent, unbroken. 23 women who'd been ordered to bow and decided collectively, simultaneously, without discussion or planning, that they were done bowing. Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. Put them down. Now. But no one did. The guards stood frozen. The moment had escaped definition. This wasn't violence that could be met with violence. Wasn't escape that could be prevented with bullets. This was something harder to name and therefore harder to fight. This was human beings remembering they were human and acting like it despite every incentive to forget. Cooper could feel it, the line between duty and conscience tearing down the middle like paper. He'd read about moments like this in history books, taught them to 11th graders in Cleveland who thought the past was boring because it was already finished. Civil disobedience, passive resistance, the moments when people said no to power, and power had to decide whether to escalate or step back. Keiko's voice carried across the yard again, soft, steady, no threat in it, no anger, just finality. We have already bowed enough. Morrison descended from his platform, face red with something beyond anger, beyond frustration, the color of a man watching his authority evaporate like water on hot metal. He walked down the line of kneeling, but no longer bowed, women his boots sending up spray with each step. He stopped in front of Keiko, the instigator, the first domino, the woman whose single glance 3 days ago had started this cascade of small rebellions that were adding up to something larger than their sum. From his holster, Morrison drew his sidearm, the sound of metal on leather loud enough to hear over the rain. He didn't aim it, didn't need to, just held it there at his side where everyone could see, where the implications were clear without being spoken. Say you're sorry. Morrison's voice had gone quiet, dangerous quiet, the kind that precedes violence the way silence precedes thunder. Bow. And this ends. Keiko looked at him, not at the gun, at his face, at the man behind the uniform and the rank and the orders he was following, because following orders was easier than questioning them. No, the word smaller this time, quieter, but somehow larger for being spoken directly to the man with the power to enforce his will with 9 millimeters of lead and powder. Morrison raised the pistol, not pointing it yet, just moving it into position. Into possibility. The rain made the metal gleam like something alive. Behind him, Cooper saw guards exchange glances. Saw Billy Walsh, the 19-year-old from Oregon, take a half step forward before Jenkins put a hand on his shoulder. The hammer clicked back. Metallic. Final. The sound that separates threat from action. Every guard in the yard understood what was happening. If Morrison pulled that trigger, if he executed an unarmed prisoner for the crime of looking up, for refusing to bow, for committing the unforgivable act of claiming dignity, everything changed. They all became something different than soldiers following orders. They became accomplices to murder disguised as discipline. Cooper's mind screamed calculations. 3 seconds to decide. If he intervened, Morrison might shoot him too. Might shoot them both. Might shoot everyone, because once you cross certain lines, the only way forward is through more violence until the violence becomes its own justification. If he didn't intervene, Keiko died. And 22 other women learned that resistance is suicide, that looking up means death, that the small rebellion of the past 3 days was just a story that would end here in mud and rain and the sound of a gunshot that no amount of paperwork could make clean. He chose. Daniel Cooper stepped forward, slowly, hands visible and empty, moving into the space between Morrison's gun and Keiko's head, into the gap where bullets travel, into the place where decisions become irreversible. Lieutenant Morrison, his voice calm, teacher voice, the tone he'd used in Cleveland classrooms when students got heated and needed someone to introduce reason before fists started flying. Lower your weapon. Morrison didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. The gun stayed raised. Sergeant, return to your post. The words came through clenched teeth, through rage that had been building for months, through grief for a brother dead at Iwo Jima, through exhaustion and fear and the terrible understanding that the war was ending and nothing they'd done here would matter except to the people they'd done it to. Cooper moved closer, 1 step, 2 steps, close enough that Morrison would have to shoot through him to reach Keiko. Sir, this violates Article 46 of the Geneva Convention. His voice steady despite his heart trying to escape his chest through brute force. Threatening execution of POWs for nonviolent defiance is a war crime. Morrison laughed. Bitter sound. No humor in it. War crime. We're fighting a war. There are no crimes, only victories and defeats, and the people who survive to write the history books. Cooper took another step. 5 feet away now, close enough to see Morrison's finger on the trigger. Close enough to see the muscle in his jaw jumping. Close enough to smell the fear and anger coming off both of them in waves. If you pull that trigger, I will report it, and you will hang for it. Not now. Not today. But when this war ends. And it is ending, sir. Germany fell 3 weeks ago. Tokyo's burning. The emperor will surrender any day. Don't let your last act in this war be murder. The silence that followed lasted 10 seconds. Felt like 10 years. Rain fell. Breath held. The entire camp balanced on the edge of Morrison's decision. Behind Cooper, another voice, Billy Walsh, barely old enough to vote, let alone kill, stepping forward. His rifle stayed slung over his shoulder, but his presence was clear. Lieutenant, I'll testify too. If you shoot her, we all will. Then Jenkins, the old farmer from Iowa who'd seen too much and stopped sleeping well months ago. Me too, sir. 3 more guards, young men, tired men. Men who'd followed every order until this one, but couldn't follow this one because this one required them to become something they couldn't come back from. Morrison's hands shook. The gun trembled. His face cycled through emotions too fast to name. Rage, grief, exhaustion, the look of a man realizing he's alone. That authority without consent is just violence with paperwork. He lowered the gun, slowly. The hammer came down with a click that sounded like relief or defeat or both. He holstered the weapon with hands that shook worse than Fumiko's had after her night in the jungle. You're all soft, his voice raw. Traitors to your country, to your brothers who died fighting these people. Cooper felt the words like punches but didn't flinch. Command will hear that you threatened an unarmed prisoner and your own men intervened to prevent an international incident. They'll thank us and reassign you. Morrison stared at him, through him, at something behind him that might have been the future or the past, or just the understanding that everything he'd believed about duty and honor and following orders had been wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed. He walked away, didn't run, walked, with his shoulders straight and his head up because, even in defeat, a military man maintains bearing. The rain swallowed him before he reached the command tent. The gun was gone, but the moment remained, heavy, real, the kind of moment that changes people in ways that don't show up in medical reports or disciplinary files. Cooper turned to the women. They were standing now. All 23, not because anyone ordered them to stand, but because standing was the natural response to deciding you're human. Rain soaked through their clothes, mud caked their knees, but their heads were up. Return to barracks, his voice rough with emotions he didn't have names for. This is over. But the women didn't move immediately. They stood in the rain with heads not down, looking straight ahead. Not at the guards, not at Cooper. Just existing. Upright, present, refusing to pretend they were invisible. Keiko spoke, her English careful, deliberate. Each word chosen with the precision of someone who knows that words matter, that they become history, that this moment would be remembered even if no one wrote it down. Sergeant Cooper, thank you. He wanted to say, don't thank me. Wanted to say I should have stopped this weeks ago. Wanted to say I'm sorry for every order I followed, every time I looked away, every moment I chose duty over decency because it was easier. Instead, he said, don't thank me. I should have done this sooner. Keiko's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Recognition, understanding, the look of one teacher seeing another and knowing that some lessons can't be taught, only learned through the doing. That is enough. She said it simply, without emphasis, just fact. That you stopped it today matters more than that you didn't stop it yesterday. The women walked back to the barracks, slowly, with dignity that hadn't been there 3 days ago, or maybe had been there all along and they just remembered how to wear it. The rain continued. The mud remained. The wire still separated prisoners from guards. But something fundamental had shifted. Billy Walsh stood beside Cooper watching them go, his voice young, uncertain. Sarge, what happens now? Cooper pulled the diary from his jacket, looked at it, thought about his mother's letter still in his other pocket, about students in Cleveland who'd asked him what made America different from the countries we fought, about all the easy answers he'd given before he had to live them. I don't know, honest answer, only answer, but whatever happens, we did the right thing, even if it cost us. That night alone in his quarters with a candle burning down to nothing, Cooper finally opened his mother's last letter. The paper crackled brittle with age and humidity. Her handwriting shook in places where the cancer had made her hands unsteady. Danny, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid you'll become someone I don't recognize. War will ask you to forget people are people. Don't, even if everyone around you does, especially then. Remember you taught your students that all people deserve dignity. Do your enemies deserve less? I'm proud of you. Not for being a soldier, for being my son who sees the world clearly. Come home, human. Love, Mom. Cooper folded the letter carefully. Then he opened the diary and added his own entry to the record that women had kept in secret. His handwriting looked clumsy next to their careful characters. English mixing with Japanese on pages that shouldn't exist but did anyway. March 22nd, 1945. Today I chose prisoners over orders, humanity over duty. My mother would be proud. The Army will not be. But I can live with that. Because for the first time since I arrived here, I can look at myself in the mirror. Keiko Yamada thanked me. I don't deserve thanks, but I'll take it, because it means I haven't lost everything. The war is ending. Maybe I'll go home human after all. He closed the diary, slept for the first time in weeks without dreaming of failures or ghosts or the weight of orders he should have refused months ago. The jungle held its breath. Birds that usually screamed at dawn stayed silent. Even the insects seemed to understand that the world was changing in ways that made noise inappropriate. The radio confirmed what everyone had been whispering for days. Japan had surrendered. The emperor's voice crackling through speakers, speaking words that emperors weren't supposed to speak. Endure the unendurable. Suffer the insufferable. Accept defeat with the same dignity we claimed in victory. The war was over. But in the bamboo camp outside Luzon, silence ruled instead of celebration. The guards stood awkwardly beside gates that didn't need to be locked anymore, but remained closed out of habit or uncertainty about what comes next. American flags were hoisted above watchtowers, the fabric heavy with rain that seemed determined to fall forever. A truck arrived, canvas covered, carrying supplies that had taken weeks to requisition and arrived too late to matter. Canned peaches, cigarettes, powdered milk. The guard who'd been a quartermaster before the war handed out tins to the women expecting gratitude. Relief, maybe tears of joy, but the prisoners just stared. Some took the cans and placed them on the ground unopened. Others turned away. The weight of liberation felt heavier than captivity, because captivity at least had rules, had structure, had the certainty of knowing where you stood, even if where you stood was in mud with your head down. Keiko held the tin in her hands. Metal cold. Alien. The label showed bright peaches suspended in syrup, photographed in a world where food came in cans and people smiled at cameras, and the future stretched ahead without barbed wire dividing it into zones of permitted and forbidden. Around her, women whispered, not celebrations, not relief, just exhaustion. When the human body has survived too long in fear, freedom feels like a trick, like a test with hidden consequences, like something that will be taken away as soon as you believe in it. According to release records compiled by military administrators who never asked the prisoners what liberation felt like, the average Japanese female POW weighed between 84 and 88 pounds at the time of surrender. Some were barely standing, muscles atrophied from malnutrition, immune systems compromised by months of fighting infections with willpower because medicine ran short and priorities ran elsewhere. Cooper walked through the yard slowly, helmet off, hair grown shaggy because regulations about appearance had stopped mattering sometime in July, when everyone realized the war was ending and grooming standards felt absurd in a place where people were dying of dysentery. His uniform hung loose. He'd lost weight too, not from hunger, from the grinding exhaustion of watching people suffer and being powerless to stop it, or complicit in causing it depending on which moment you examined. The camp had been handed over to medical staff, Red Cross workers with clean uniforms and shocked expressions, nurses who'd been briefed about conditions but weren't prepared for the reality of what briefings couldn't convey. The smell, the hollowness in eyes that had seen too much, the way people flinched at kindness because kindness usually preceded punishment. Cooper stopped near Keiko. She didn't bow. Neither did he. They stood like two people at a funeral for something that didn't have a name. Not the war, not their individual suffering, but the part of themselves they'd lost in the space between orders and conscience. You can go, his voice quiet, stating fact. Not offering permission because she didn't need his permission. Had never needed it except that the men with guns had decided she did. Keiko looked at him for a long second, then turned toward the open gate, the gate that had been closed for 5 months, the gate that divided prison from not prison, the gate that should have felt like salvation but just felt like a different kind of boundary. As prisoners filed out in groups of 10, processed through tables where administrators checked names against lists and handed out papers that proved you existed and were being released to go back to a country that might not want you back, Cooper stood watching from the gate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. The diary. He'd kept it through everything, through Morrison's removal, through the 2 weeks of confusion when no one was officially in charge and the camp ran on momentum and habit, through the surrender announcement and the chaos that followed. He hesitated, then slipped it into a supply crate marked repatriation documents. Maybe it would make it to Japan. Maybe it would get lost in the bureaucracy that swallowed most things. Maybe someday someone would find it and understand what happened here in the gap between what was ordered and what was done. When the last group disappeared down the muddy road, heading toward trucks that would take them to ships that would take them home, or to whatever home meant, after everything, Cooper looked around the empty yard. Floodlights were off. Fences creaked in the wind. The only thing left was mud and memories, and the question of what you do with the rest of your life after you've seen what people are capable of on both sides of the wire. He picked up something from the ground, a photograph, water damaged. Water, mud stained, the boy's face still smiling through everything that had tried to erase it. Fumiko's nephew who died in the Tokyo firebombing, the stand-in for her real son Daichi, who might be alive, who she'd never stopped hoping for, the space between truth and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. On the back, written in pencil that had run but was still legible, 3 words in Cooper's handwriting for Fumiko Saito. He tried to return it, had failed, kept it anyway because throwing it away felt like murder and keeping it felt like penance. He kept walking, not toward headquarters, not toward the barracks where his remaining gear waited to be packed, into the trees beyond the camp, where the wire ended and the jungle began, where no one gave orders and no one followed them, and the rain fell because that's what rain does, washing everything without judgment or preference or the belief that some people deserve to be clean more than others. The train from the port crawled through a landscape of ghosts, cities flattened, bridges twisted like broken bones. Keiko pressed her face to the window and tried to remember what home looked like before the bombs turned memory into rubble. Her house still stood, barely, roof tiles missing, walls scorched black on one side where fire had licked but not consumed. Her mother-in-law, 65 and graying, opened the door. Behind her a boy, 7 years old now, taller, thinner, eyes that looked too old for his face. Takeshi stared at the woman in the torn uniform who weighed less than she should and smelled like diesel and defeat. His grandmother whispered something. He tilted his head, studying Keiko the way children study strangers. Then his eyes widened, a flash of recognition. Not of her face, but of something deeper. The way she stood, the shape of her hands, the memory of someone who used to lift him before the world fell apart. Okasan. The word tentative. A question. A hope, Keiko nodded. Couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around everything she'd wanted to say for 5 months. He ran. Not the careful walk of a boy who'd learned to be cautious, but the sprint of someone who'd been waiting so long that caution didn't matter anymore. He crashed into her arms, wrapping around her waist, face pressed against her stomach. They held each other. No words, just breathing. Just the proof that they'd both survived when so many others hadn't. Later, after rice and tea, and the careful questions that children ask when they're trying to understand where their mothers went, Keiko would tell him stories. Not about the camp, not about the mud and the wire and the moment she looked up. Just stories about dignity, about choosing to stand when the world wants you to kneel, about the teacher she used to be and hoped to be again. But that night in the house that had survived when so many others hadn't, she just held her son and let the tears come. Because dignity doesn't mean not crying. It means choosing when. Fumiko Saito stood in a Red Cross relief center in Tokyo holding an envelope that had been delivered 3 days earlier. Inside a letter from her sister, Yuki, dated 6 weeks prior. Daichi is alive. He asks about you every day. He's waiting. Fumiko's hands shook as she read those 4 sentences over and over. Her son, 4 years old when she'd last seen him, 5.5 now, alive, waiting. The nephew's photograph had been a placeholder for hope, but hope had always been Daichi, real, breathing, somewhere in this ruined city. She tucked the letter into her pocket and walked toward the address Yuki had written at the bottom, through streets that used to be neighborhoods, past foundations where houses used to stand, following directions that might be obsolete because Tokyo had been remade in fire and nothing stayed where you left it. The apartment building had survived. 3rd floor end of the hall. Fumiko knocked with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The door opened. Yuki, 32, now thinner than Fumiko remembered but alive. Behind her, a small boy peered around her legs. He looked at Fumiko with solemn eyes, studied her the way children study something unfamiliar but important. Yuki knelt beside him, whispered, "This is the lady from my song, the one who took care of people when they were hurt, the one who never stopped thinking about you." Daichi took a tentative step forward, then another. He stopped 3 feet from Fumiko. "Are you Mama?" Fumiko's voice broke. Yes. He didn't run into her arms, didn't rush. Just walked forward with the careful dignity of a child who'd learned that people you love can disappear and might not come back. When he reached her, he took her hand, examined it, traced the scar on her palm where she'd cut herself on surgical equipment 3 years ago. "Mama has hurt hands," Yuki told me, "so she could help people." Fumiko lifted him then, slowly, carefully, like something precious that might break. He wrapped his arms around her neck, and she felt his heart beating against her chest and realized this is why she'd survived. Not for herself, for this, for him, for the proof that love doesn't die just because the world tries to kill it. They stood like that for a long time. Yuki closed the door quietly, gave them space, gave them time to remember they belonged to each other. Later, Fumiko would burn the nephew's photograph in a small ceremony on the apartment balcony. Not to forget, but to let go. She would whisper thank you to the boy who'd kept her company through hell, tell him his job was done, that she had her real son now and could finally stop pretending. The ashes scattered in Tokyo wind, and Fumiko felt lighter than she had in years. Daniel Cooper, 76 years old, sat in his living room reading the newspaper when the phone rang. A woman's voice, accented English, formal, careful. Is this Daniel Cooper, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Philippines, 1945? His heart stopped, started again. Yes, my name is Dr. Daichi Saito. I'm a cardiologist in Tokyo. My mother asked me to find you. She said you kept a promise, even when you didn't have to. She said you gave her back her dignity when everyone else wanted to take it. Cooper's hands shook. The phone almost slipped. Fumiko. She's here. Would you like to speak with her? A pause, breathing. Then a voice he'd heard only in rain and desperation 50 years ago, now older but unmistakable. Sergeant Cooper, you tried to return the photograph. I know. My sister found it in a Red Cross box in 1947, with a note for Fumiko Saito. Cooper couldn't speak. The photograph he'd kept for 50 years sat on his desk, the nephew smiling through water damage and time. He'd written those words on the back, but never found her address. I wanted to say thank you, not for the photograph, for standing between the gun and Keiko, for choosing mercy when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything, Cooper said, voice rough. It saved me. They talked for an hour, about Daichi, who'd become a doctor, about Keiko, who died in 1987 but had taught 3 generations of students about dignity, about the diary that had survived and found its way to a museum where people could learn that resistance doesn't always require violence. When they hung up, Cooper sat in the silence of his too large house and realized he wasn't alone. He'd never been alone. The choices he'd made in mud and rain 50 years ago had echoed forward through time, had saved lives, had taught lessons, had proven that one person choosing mercy can change history. He opened the box under his bed, pulled out his manuscript, the 112 publishers had rejected, and he began to type again. Not for publication, for the record. For the students who would come after and need to know that doing the right thing matters even when no one's watching, especially then, 8 years after surrender. The war was history now, statistics and textbooks, dates that students memorized for exams and forgot immediately after. Numbers that made sense on paper but meant nothing to people who hadn't lived them. In a quiet corner of a museum in Tokyo, past the tanks and medals and uniforms displayed behind glass like insects pinned to boards, a small case sat unnoticed by most visitors. Inside, under soft yellow light that made everything look sepia-toned and distant, rested an artifact. A rice paper diary, edges browned by tropical rain. Cover made from repurposed paper that had once been official forms, stitched together with thread pulled from a torn sleeve. The label read only author unknown. Luzon POW Camp, 1945. Visitors passed without stopping. The museum was full of more dramatic objects, weapons, battle flags, things that made war look exciting instead of what it was, mud and fear, and the slow grinding away of everything that makes life worth living. But one woman paused, teacher, mid-20s, graying early from stress or genetics or both. She'd come here researching women's experiences for her students. 12-year-old girls who thought history was about great men making important decisions and didn't understand that most of history was made by ordinary people deciding whether to bow or stand. She read the diary, cover to cover, 2 hours, stood there while her feet hurt and her neck ached and other visitors flowed past like water around a stone. The words hit her like physical things. Keep your head down. We learn to survive by pretending not to see. 19 women alive in Block 3, one guard cried. They say we are enemies, but when they look at us, I see something like pity. Her hand trembled as she copied phrases into her notebook. not for publication, not for academic papers, just for herself. For the lesson she would teach next week about what it means to be human when the world insists you're enemy or victim or anything except simply human. She reached the final page, found something that stopped her breath, a line in different handwriting, English mixed with Japanese, clumsy letters that looked like someone had written them in the dark or through tears or both. Some orders never leave you. Signed D. Cooper, Sergeant, United States Army. Below it, in the same careful characters that had filled the rest of the diary, someone had added one final line: dignity cannot be commanded, only chosen. We chose. The teacher stood there. Museum lights dimmed for closing. Guards gently reminded visitors that it was time to leave. She carefully closed her notebook, bowed slightly to the diary case as if the pages inside could see and understand respect. Outside, Tokyo hummed with life. Streetcars, laughter, the sounds of a nation rebuilt. Children playing games their parents had been too traumatized to teach them. Old people sitting in parks pretending they didn't remember when those parks had been rubble. The teacher walked to her school, small building, 40 students, girls who would become women in a world that was supposed to be different now, supposed to value dignity and rights and the idea that all people are created equal, even if the war had tried to prove otherwise. Next week, she would teach them about the diary, about 23 women who decided to look up, about one American soldier who decided that following orders wasn't the same as doing right, about the space between duty and conscience and how that space is where character lives. She would not tell them it was hopeful, would not lie and say that good always wins or that standing up for dignity comes without cost. Would just show them the words and let them decide what those words meant. Because the truth is never simple, and the people who tell you it is are the ones who want you to keep your head down. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when the last person who remembers it dies. And even then, it doesn't really end. It just becomes history, becomes lessons we teach ourselves about never again, becomes stories we tell to convince ourselves we've learned something. The diary proved one thing. Even in captivity, even when every structure of power says you're nothing, you can choose dignity. You can look up, you can say no. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very cursed, someone with power will choose to step aside and let you keep standing. The words written on rice paper in mud and rain and desperation would outlive everyone who wrote them, would outlive the guards and the prisoners and the politicians who declared wars and negotiated peace, would outlive the certainty and the righteousness and the simple stories about good and evil. They would survive in a glass case in a museum in Tokyo where young teachers came to learn that resistance doesn't always look like revolution, that sometimes it looks like 23 women standing in the rain, that sometimes it looks like one soldier stepping between a gun and an unarmed person, that sometimes it looks like keeping your head up when the whole world wants you to bow, and that sometimes that's enough.